I'm Craig Timberg. I'm the national technology reporter at the Washington Post. Beside me, we have two of the giants of cybersecurity and intelligence in Washington for as long as for decades now.
This is how he means we're old.
This is General Hayden. He's the former head of the NSA and the CIA. Richard Clarke here has been a top White House advisor, counterterrorism advisor to presidents for some years now. And I wanted to dive right into the news that has been occupying all of us at the Washington Post and other news organizations for a while and get their perspective on this. We've been writing a lot about Facebook and propaganda that emanated from the Russians, and having covered cybersecurity for the past few years, this is something of a novel take on the issue, right? We all think of cybersecurity as hacks, penetrating systems, and here we have, a foreign adversary essentially using tools that Silicon Valley created to influence a U.S. election. So I'm curious if we should think about this as a cybersecurity issue and what sort of lessons we should take away from what's happened. Why don't we start with General Hayden?
Sure. First of all, thank you for your reporting. And as I follow it along, the wheels start to turn here as to what does this stuff in the foreground mean for how we should think about the deep background. And Craig, what I'm reminded of, I kind of got dipped into this cyber thing in the mid-90s. I'd come out of the Balkans where there was a war that was medieval in cause and conduct, and I'm dropped into San Antonio to take command of the Air Intelligence Agency. And we're kind of leading edge thinking about this within the Department of Defense. And a lot of things that happen today, you can see the roots back in Security Hill in San Antonio in the 90s. Cyber command, cyber as a domain, those concepts which are now American organization and American military doctrine. We had a debate. I still recall this. We had the AIA, the Air Force unit I commanded, and I also headed up something called the Joint Command and Control Warfare Center, which is, by definition, a joint body. And the philosophical discussion, and we looked like Jesuits at a medieval university, okay, as to what is it we're talking about. And there was a body of thought that we're talking about cyber, land, sea, air, space, cyber. It's a domain, it's an operational environment, we're gonna go fight there. And then there was a body of thought that what we really were talking about was information, right? And so if you thought it was the latter, then all of a sudden, what it was you need to be concerned about was not just your network, not just your computer, not just digital things, but information things. Looking backwards, it included defense suppression, electronic countermeasures. Looking forward, you would actually bring in PSYOPs, or what we're now calling MISO, psychological operations. We even thought you probably had to bring the public affairs guys into this bubble. All right? So we had this grand debate. I think history will judge. We broke over here. We broke over here with cyber. And that's how you get a cyber command, and that's been quite successful, and that's a good news story. But this is not that. The Russians went here. And if you read the writings of General Gerasimov, who's now the chief of the general staff, he talks quite plainly, quite openly about combat in the information domain. And now we see the Russians performing mightily against our political structures in the information domain, but even now, we are still trying to look at it through our lens over here, which is cyber. They stole our stuff. When the intel community finally got up to Trump Tower on 6th January, you had Jim Clapper and Mike Rogers and Jim Comey, and they finally laid out all the case that, no, the Russians stole the DNC data, and then they did this, and then they did that. The Trump campaign, no longer able to kind of deny fact of, redefined what they had just been briefed on as, we really got a cyber problem. It's a bad cyber problem. The Russians, the Chinese, that 400-pound guy, we really got a cyber problem. And that is a reflection, I think, of our lack of definitional expertise. We think about this as a digital thing, the theft of data, the firewall, all important, and we'll get to that directly. But what the Russians are doing is taking the game to a completely different level. They are trying to dominate in the information space. It's just not a cyber issue.
And Mr. Clarke, does he have it right?
He does, but let me frame it as two distinct points. This is a Venn diagram between cybersecurity, which is clearly an aspect of this, and psychological warfare, which is clearly an aspect, and they overlap. The Russians are using cybersecurity techniques as a way to conduct their psychological warfare operations, but it's not new. The Russians have been doing what they call disinformatia and active measures since the Russian Revolution and before. And again, let me compliment you on your great reporting. Thank God for the Washington Post.
Can I get a T-shirt that says that?
I actually have one that says something about democracy
dies in darkness.
dies in darkness.
Or
I
how
do
about
have
this?
that T-shirt.
American intelligence says thank you, Washington Post.
First time ever.
But I do have a slight criticism of your reporting. I think it's very tactical, and we want those tactical stories and revelations. But we need to step back and look at the strategic issue here. What's going on? What's going on is that Russia has decided that it's going to be aggressive in regaining its standing in the world. And what happened in the United States is a piece of that. What continues to happen in the United States is a piece of that. They seek to have countries divide into little bits. They're very, pro-Brexit. I'm sure they'd be supportive of California breaking off. In fact, they were. They're very supportive of putting one faction against the other, and that's why they're behind the Facebook ads and whatnot. They're trying to create chaos. And as we go forward, as Bob Mueller comes out with the results of his investigation, we need to recognize that their goal is chaos in the United States and Western Europe. We have to constantly remind people of that, and we need to think about that in everything we do. We don't want to give them the goal that they seek. And when they're involved in manipulating things to advance chaos in our society here and in Western Europe, we need to call them out. That's the first point. The second point is that this presidential election was the first presidential election after social media became probably the major way in which American voters get news. That's an important point. The majority of Americans get news from social media. They don't watch the ABC News at 6:30, but they should, since I work for ABC News.
CNN's good too about that.
I hear that. I wouldn't know. I don't watch it. It's on some cable, I think. But most Americans get their news now from social media, and therefore it's not surprising that this was the first election in which social media were used as a weapon by a foreign government. Because a foreign government has now decided to get involved in our elections, both through social media and through hacking of political campaigns, political parties, and state election offices, we can no longer afford the approach that federal elections can be left up to county commissioners. As much as I love county commissioners, and I know they're trying to do a good job on a small budget, federal elections cannot be, the security of federal elections cannot be their responsibility. The federal government needs to reassert, and under the Constitution it can. And the Constitution says the federal government can designate the manner of these elections. The federal government needs to reassert its priority, control of federal elections, and monitor them for security and adequately fund their security, and not give that over to county commissioners who don't have the expertise or the money.
You know, it's interesting to hear you say that. Back a year ago, I was working on a story about, could the U.S. election be hacked, right? And I was looking at those issues, the voting machines and paper ballots and and those touchscreen ballots. And looking back on that reporting and our thinking about it at the time, we really kind of missed the boat, right? The election wasn't going to be hacked in the formal kind of
count. Right.
Yeah, the count wasn't going to be hacked, but the election apparently
affected.
Yeah, it could be affected by these forces that we didn't perceive adequately at the time, and it makes me maybe a tiny bit more sympathetic to Facebook's account that, oh, we just didn't see this coming, right? So Mark Zuckerberg famously says a few days after the election that it was a pretty crazy idea to think that that fake news could have altered the outcome of the election, and maybe he's right. But I think it is very clear now that they had trouble conceptualizing of the kind of attack that actually was leveled on them and on the U.S. political system, and which makes me wonder: is it reasonable to think that somebody should have understood this sooner and put up alarm bells in a more forceful? Let me start with you, Mr. Clarke, on this one.
You know, I've just written a book called Warnings, which is available on Amazon, in which I look at 14 case studies across a whole variety of disciplines, asking why didn't people pay attention when an expert gave a warning that later turned out to be true. And I have a little methodology for figuring out which experts are likely to be true. The bottom line is this happens in every field of endeavor. That you miss warnings. There are institutional settings that look for warnings. Sometimes they're good, sometimes they're not. This one, I think people can be forgiven for not seeing coming.
General Hayden, you were warning before the election about the prospect of the Russians influencing this.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Did you conceptualize the kind of
sort
of attack
your
we're
reporting? Your reporting suggests to me that they had gotten their game to a point beyond which I had assumed. Yeah, all right. So let's parse out what happened. They stole the data. All right. I think that's general agreement. That's a baby step. But by the way, I got to tell you, stealing the DNC emails, okay, hacking into that is actually honorable international espionage. All right, all countries do that. All right,
including ours, would we do that?
Yeah, if I were director of NSA and we could penetrate United Russia, just Putin's party, and we actually really cared what they said, that would be a legitimate foreign intelligence target.
Speaking.
Yes, yeah, it would be a legitimate target under accepted international practice. What happens next then? All right, that's the big deal. That's the term we've been using, is weaponizing the information. So it's WikiLeaks, it's DC leaks, it's pushing it forward. Okay, that's kind of linear. I'd kind of expect that. Then the army of trolls who touch the data, all right, and who kind of convince the Google algorithms that these stories are trending. Whoa, no, wow. That's not linear. That's a discontinuity. That's getting more interesting. And now what your stories are reporting is micro-targeting of specific groups in the American electoral process. Whoa. All right? I mean, you can see the revelations growing here that sophistication of the Russian effort was, I think, far greater than even, I've talked to John Brennan and Jim Clapper. They kind of got wind of, this isn't right, about April, May. It was different of a kind than we've seen in the past. By August, they were urgent, okay? That this is different in scale, it's different in style, and it's different in that it's approved at the highest level of the Russian Federation. They had a little trouble getting the political attention that they needed, because frankly it forced the president with a really ugly decision. All right, and
it never happened before.
Yeah, and the instinct is, well, make sure you're really sure before you force an ugly decision on me, so you lose some time. So in August, John gets to throw a brushback pitch at Bortnikov, who is his counterpart, saying knock this off. September, the president does the verbal warning to Putin at the G20, and then in October, Jim Clapper and Jay Johnson go out with the kind of the facts of the case. But even the facts of that case don't get to what it is you're now reporting.
Right. It's true.
But if you look back for the warning,
yep.
I think the warning was in, again, American journalism. Great piece in 2015 in another newspaper,
Yes.
Sunday Magazine.
Very good piece.
About the Internet Institute in Petersburg. And a fascinating story about the trolls, about the bots. And the key to this story was that the Internet Institute in Petersburg had run a story in US social media that a refinery had blown up in Louisiana. And it was very well done, very convincing, looked like CNN stories and whatnot. And of course, the refinery had not blown up. And the article asked, why would they have done that? Why would they have tried to convince people that a refinery had blown up in Louisiana? And I remember sitting at the dining room table on a Sunday, looking at that story and saying, this is an important story, and I don't know what's going on. I don't understand why Russia would want to convince people that a refinery had blown up in Louisiana, but we need to keep thinking about this, and then I forgot about it.
Before you run on, Craig, can I just add, and this is getting harder, all right? Because there are Americans who are using everything we've just talked about here to challenge the legitimacy of the current president of the United States. And I think it's really important intellectually for us to separate those two things. Did the Russians affect the election? I think the answer is absolutely. How much? Have no idea. It's not just that I don't know, it is unknowable. So we just have to cabin that or put that away. There's no question about legitimacy, and now we've got to get on with this. Right. All right, so that's
there is
a very
a question.
important step.
There is a question about collusion.
And we'll find more about that, yes or no?
I think we will, yes.
Well, as fascinating
Yes or
as
no?
this is, let's pivot to another issue that's been in the news. It's more of a classic cybersecurity issue, the Equifax hack. One of the worst in history by various measures. 145 million consumers now seem to have wrapped up in the incredibly personal data, social security, names, birthdays, credit card numbers, and such. Let me start with you, Mr. Clarke. Aside from like the obvious stuff, like you need to patch your software, I mean, at a policy level, what are the lessons learned with the Equifax hack?
Well, so there's policy level within companies, and then there's policy level at the national level. Let's start with companies. Policy level within companies is you have to have a good risk profile of your company, know what could go wrong that matters, and you have to have a governance structure that monitors that. So it cannot be the case that you get hacked and the CFO doesn't know that day, or the CEO doesn't know. I'm a member of corporate boards, and I'm, not surprisingly, the guy who is supposed to be keeping an eye on cybersecurity for these companies at the board level. I need to know the day one of my companies gets hacked, that day. So they had a governance problem. But part of the governance is knowing whether or not you're doing enough. Obviously they were not doing enough. They didn't have network discovery. They didn't know what was going on their own network. They apparently didn't even know they had machines on their network that hadn't been patched. Companies need to realize that you need to spend money to do this. Beginning in the 1990s, we underpriced information technology. We put information technology into companies across the board, every kind of company. We did it quickly. American productivity went through the roof as a result. And we said, wow, we can do things so much more cheaply now that we have information technology. Wrong. The calculation on how much information technology cost never priced in security. And companies today are, on average, spending between 3 and 5% of their IT budget on cybersecurity. That is a recipe for disaster. If you're spending 3 to 5%, I know it's a gross metric, but if that's where you are, you're going to get hacked. You cannot do all of the many, many, many things you need to do to secure a network today. We know how to secure networks today. There are companies that do not get hacked. There are government organizations that do not get hacked. We know how to do it. It takes a lot of skill, a lot of skilled people, and a lot of software. And it costs money. And it costs much more, like 8 or 10% or 12% of your IT budget than 3 to 5. So that's at the corporate level. At the national level, we do, I agree with Rob, we do need, I think I overheard him say, we need a national standard for breach notification. We do.
Yeah.
That national standard cannot be less than the existing California standard. The last time We tried to do this at the national level. The Chamber of Commerce and people like that came out of the woodwork and said, oh yes, let's have a national level, and let's make it meaningless. We do need a national breach notification law, and it needs to be at least as good as the best state law, number one. Number two, companies like Equifax will continue to screw up until there is a penalty for doing so. My colleague Rob Kanaki, who used to serve at the White House, said the other day, the way we solved oil spills and made it something an oil company really doesn't want to have happen, oil spills, is we charged them by the gallon for what they spilled by federal law. And after that federal law, oil spills plummeted. If we charge people by the data loss, if public information, publicly identifiable information is lost, you should pay for it by the person. You should pay $10 for every one of them. Multiply that times 143 million. If you pass that law, this problem will go away.
I was just going to pile on. I was going to bring up Rob Kanaki's article as well. And Rob reasons by analogy with the Exxon Valdez. Right. All right. And after the Exxon Valdez is passed, indeed, Congress says you're going to pay for it by the drink. Yeah. All right. If it goes out, you're going to pay for it. Which then led the oil companies to look for insurance. Yeah. And so there's a private sector motivator.
And insurance requirements came in. Yeah. If you're going to get insurance, you have to do X.
So it's not the government saying thou shalt, right, or how you should do it. It was, here's the cost for doing it.
Exactly.
And then they want to go get insured. And then the insurance companies say, well, let me give you the number here. Let me do it real quick. There's your number if you just do it in single-hulled tankers. On the other hand, if you invest in double-hulled tankers, let me give you the insurance, and everyone moved to double-hulled tankers. And so what Rob is suggesting is a government role that doesn't compel how you do this, sets up a penalty, and American business models with insurance will take you to a very happy place, right, the way it did with oil.
And in that example, an insurance company would have said to Equifax, you have all of this data, you have to encrypt it if you want to be insured. And encryption doesn't work unless it's paired with good identity access management, the multi-factor privileged access management. So have a multi-factor PAM system, have encryption, and we'll insure you. If that had happened, we wouldn't have an Equifax problem.
But you see the government, rather than whistle, red hat, clipboard, walking in and giving you check marks, the government sets up a structure that drives the business case over a long term to be responsive and responsible.
But that will never happen as long as the Congress thinks that regulation is a four-letter word. We need additional regulation. All regulation is not bad. And this nonsense that we have to get rid of 2 regulations every time we put one in is just silly. We need to do regulation like the one we've just discussed.
So here we all agree that we haven't always seen the new threat coming, other than Mr. Clarke, who's made a career of seeing the next threat.
No. I missed the last one.
So tell me, what aren't we seeing now? Like, what are the threats that are coming around the horizon that you all in the business can see?
When I was director, I used to get this question: what do you think is going to surprise you next year?
So, Director, what's going to surprise us?
There's a difference between intelligence and fortune telling.
Yeah. Craig, I don't have a good answer, and I didn't have a good answer for that question too. What's going to surprise you next year? I just kind of made a face, from the last several years in government. I will offer a couple of thoughts, kind of factors bearing on the problem, and it's my best shot. Yeah. There is a tendency, particularly within government, where the walls are high and you keep the secrets in. There is a tendency in government to underplay discontinuities. There's a tendency in government to think tomorrow is going to look a lot like today. I had the phrase used to me recently by an intelligence veteran: we're not so good looking around corners. Okay? And what you get is the tyranny of expertise. So one very concrete example, you have a poor unfortunate setting fire to himself in a mid-sized Tunisian city. Recall? And the original estimate out of the American intelligence community is that Ben Ali, the dictator of Tunisia, been there, done that, saw the movie. He knows how to deal with this. They'll hit white water for 7-10 days, but in the end, Ben Ali will still be there. Well, not only was Ben Ali gone, there were 1 million people in Tahrir Square in Egypt within 5 or 6 weeks. It was the tyranny of expertise, the projection of continuity that captured this. One way, I'm answering this, Craig, as a government guy. One way the government might be able to reduce that danger is to actually open the doors to the views of the broader American society, who actually has some interesting perspectives on things going on out there. As your Morning Sunday magazine guy had a thought out there, no intelligence, no purloined secrets, right. no espionage, but just because he's not trapped into, I got to get the PDB out by tomorrow, right, is able to look at these alternative scenarios. So I don't have a good answer, but I do have a way to perhaps get us to a better place, and that is a far more permeable membrane between our security services and the wisdom of the broader society.
Yeah. Mr. Clarke?
Well, that's what I call for in the book Warnings, which is available on Amazon.
I have a book there too, but it's not the same title.
The things that we look at in Warnings for the future are the Internet of Things, artificial intelligence, gene editing, CRISPR-Cas9, among others. Of those, appropriate for this audience, I think, is both AI and the Internet of Things. If the numbers that Gartner, for example, uses on the Internet of Things are right, we're going from approximately 5 billion devices today on the Internet of Things to approximately 30 billion devices in the next 3 to 4 years. That's an extraordinary revolution. A quiet revolution, one that will occur without your seeing it. But to use the jargon of the cyber world, that vastly increases the attack surface. And most of those devices are being rushed to market without embedded security. And every time that has happened in the past, it's been disastrous. So if I were forced to make a prediction, which I don't like to do any more than you do, I would at least think about things that could result as a consequence of the Internet of Things. And then on AI, there's a whole debate going on about whether or not we need to control, regulate, limit AI. While I'm in favor of some regulation, and I don't run away when someone says the word regulation, I think the idea of regulating AI right now is crazy. And we need to see where that innovation can take us, keeping an eye on it. And maybe the people who worry about AI are right. I doubt it. But keeping an eye on it. But please do not suppress the innovation that can come from AI.
And just take a thought that Richard had here about artificial intelligence, Internet of Things. I mean, we're just going to get more of this, right? Yeah, right. So the broad assumption, I think, and go back, run the clock back 10 or 15 years, as you get more and more immediate, intimate communications between and among human beings, all right? I think there was a natural instinct that would lead broadly, over time, in the direction of greater understanding, because we get to know each other better. It has led in the opposite direction. It has driven most of our species back to tribe, back to family, back to faith, and away from a convergence in terms of a common human identity. That was unexpected. And I guess one of the questions I would ask is, do we continue down that path, all right, which is kind of nativist, nationalist, populist? Do we continue down that path? Or is that just the byproduct of first-generation drivers in the new domain? And as we become more experienced drivers, does what we had expected in the beginning become more and more prominent? I don't know. But right now, this thing that connects us magically, technologically, seems to be most useful as a tool for those who would divide us. And is that a permanent condition or not?
Thank you both, gentlemen. I really appreciate the robust discussion we've had. Everyone can give a round of applause for this. Thank you. Thank you.
We have to disagree more.
Yeah, next time. So up next is my colleague, Brian Fung, and a panel of experts to keep up the discussion. Thank you all for being here with us today, and we'll do this again sometime soon. Thank you, General Hayden.